All right, so you might be wondering, why are we going to study Maslow's hierarchy of needs? And there's a few reasons. In terms of most obviously, in Social 10, we're evaluating globalization. To what extent has globalization proved itself to be beneficial to mankind? Well, how do you measure something like that? How can you evaluate the benefit of globalization without understanding, well, what are our needs? So we're going to be studying Maslow's hierarchy of needs so that we can properly evaluate globalization. So when we look at the global village, we can say, is it successful? Well, let's look at human needs. If it's meeting human needs, then yes, I guess it is successful. If it's not meeting human needs, then it's not. So that's the Social 10 reason why we're studying Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're also studying Maslow's hierarchy of needs because in Social 30, you'll be studying political economic systems much like you did in grade 9. And again, there, you will be evaluating them. And when you evaluate the success of capitalism or socialism or communism or democracy or dictatorships, it's good to have some kind of criteria to that evaluation. And a logical criteria is it meeting our needs according to Maslow? So, definitely there's a big pull there. Also later, we're going to be studying human rights in grade 10 and to some extent 11 and 12. And when we look at human rights, there's a good correlation with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, let us begin a quick look at Maslow as hierarchy of needs. So, in your notes right now, you might have down the title Needs, and then you might have down the subtitle Maslow. So Maslow will be a psychiatrist and a psychologist, and through psychology, he's going to be studying what are the hierarchy of needs for mankind. That we must meet these ones before we can move on to the next stage in the hierarchy. And once we meet these ones, then we can move up the hierarchy to the next stage. We have a quick 3-minute video that's going to do an excellent job introducing this topic.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a theory in psychology. It argues that there are 5 stages of human needs that motivate our behavior. Abraham Maslow proposed his theory in 1943 after studying what he called exemplary people, such as Albert Einstein or Eleanor Roosevelt.
So we're not too excited about the year, and the fact that he got this information by studying Einstein and Roosevelt is pretty cool, but what I'd really like you to focus in on is what are the stages, so that we can apply that hierarchy of needs to, in this case, in grade 10, globalization.
First, there are physiological needs, such as the need to breathe, eat, drink, or sleep.
So that's stage 1, that's the bottom of the pyramid. That's the base of the pyramid, as you can see in the top left corner. So these are our physiological needs: to eat, to sleep, to drink, to breathe. And you could argue that these are our most immediate. That if you deprive mankind of these, mankind cannot survive long. Without air, it's minutes. Without water, it's days. Without food, might be a short number of weeks. I've heard that we don't need sleep, but I'm not sure that I've ever really met someone that survives without it.
The moment we get enough of that and we feel awake and our bellies are full, we get motivated by the next thing. Now we want safety. We try to earn money, build up resources, and look for shelter that protects us against dangers. Once we are satisfied and feel safe, we have to...
So stage 2, safety, shelter becomes a little more sophisticated. But again, you can't have the luxury of building a more permanent housing if you're struggling for air. If you can't have the luxury of providing more short or long-term safety if you can't breathe. So that's why those physiological ones were first, and now you can move on to safety. So if you have an individual that is struggling finding food and water on a daily basis, they probably don't feel safe. That's why a lot of homeless people may have issues with safety, that they don't feel safe, and they can't feel safe in most situations.
Time to think about what we want next. At stage 3, we seek love and belonging.
So once you have your physiological needs met and then your safety needs met, then we can move on to love and belonging. But if you don't feel safe, the argument is, you don't have the opportunity to feel love. That safety is a precursor to love. And that's a good tip for anybody in a relationship or wanting to be in a relationship. That if you're coveting somebody to be your partner, they need to feel safe around you.
We desire to be close to family and friends, belong to a society, or join a gang. But the moment we feel completely part of a group, we already wish to be a little different than the rest.
So once you have that love and belonging, once you have that collective identity, that group identity, once you belong to a couple or to a gang, like they said, then we're like, okay, how am I different from the group? Now I can move on to my self-esteem, my individualism.
Stage 4, we look for esteem, self-confidence, and respect from our peers. We want to be someone. If we have money, we buy a fancy watch. If we have a brain, we write or think or work a lot.
And it makes sense that you can't pursue esteem goals if you're still struggling breathing, or if you have no food, or if you have no shelter, or if you don't feel a sense of belonging or love. It's hard to be pursuing esteem goals if you have no connection to anything else around you. So in order to move on to esteem, you have those other goals met.
Motivation to perform and compete is now at its highest. Students, sportsmen, and inventors excel. Neil Armstrong even flew to the moon. Only if we breathe and drink and eat and sleep enough, and we feel safe and part of a group and still special, only then can we reach level 5.
Anybody know the term for level 5? Self-actualization. So self-actualization, they'll put the word up in a minute, it basically means this idea that you feel fulfillment. That your purpose is clear and you are pursuing it.
Self-actualization. Now we can relax, be creative, accept facts for what they are, give back or do whatever we want. No more pressure, unless of course there is trouble below. If you are a leader and believe in the theory, use it. First, make sure...
So the last 40 seconds of this video doesn't really apply to us, but the first 2 minutes really does, because once again, we have this thing that we're evaluating this year, globalization. To what extent has globalization benefited man? Well, how do you measure something like that? How do you evaluate something like that? Well, you can evaluate it on different tiers, different criteria. At its most basic, have we, as a species, through globalization, have we been able to provide our physiological needs? And unfortunately, the answer is no. But has globalization meant that more people are getting their physiological needs met? Or are we seeing that it's less people? So that's something to look for today. Do we have poverty? Do we have hunger? Do we have more people in hunger today proportionately than we did 30 years ago? So we have physiological needs. And then we have, in order to move up past physiological, then you have to first meet those. So if there's a quarter or a third of the population of the world still struggling on physiological needs, then maybe globalization is not the best way to use the finite resources of the planet. Maybe there's a different way to use the finite resources and to ensure that everyone can get close to self-actualization. So, we're going to move on to our next subtopic here today, which is poverty. Unfortunately, even in the title of poverty, you can assume that the argument here is that maybe our needs are not being met. So in this cartoon, we can see that the needs of one guy is being met, his tier 1 needs are being met, his physiological needs are being met. It doesn't look like this individual's needs are being met. So it's the ideological perspective of this source that the physiological needs of some on the planet are being met while the physiological needs of others are being ignored. We call that disparity, haves and have not, rich and poor. And globally, at a macro sense, macro meaning nation level, you can divide the world into have and have not countries. So at a macro level, Canada's a have country, and at a macro level, a country like Sudan is a have not country. And these have and have not countries of the world seem to fit a grouping, that the have countries of the world are basically the north, the industrialized, and the have not countries of the world are basically the southern hemisphere. There are a few exceptions, like Australia, New Zealand, in the southern hemisphere, but that's due to some of their colonial history with the British Empire. So sometimes we talk about a north-south divide, a have and a have not divide in the world, where there's increased poverty. Now, living in Wetaskiwin, we know at a micro level, not a macro, a national, but a micro level, an individual level. If you look at the microeconomics of Wetaskiwin, we have haves and have-nots here. We have disparity in our city. So sometimes macroeconomics, by looking at the big picture, it's overlooking some of the finer detail within the picture. So we can talk about disparity, we can talk about poverty, and we can say Canada is a rich country, but within Canada we have people living in extreme desperation. We have homeless people. There are thousands of homeless people in Edmonton alone. In a city of Wetaskiwin size that is apparently 16,000, but I don't believe it's that large, we have so many homeless that we have a homeless shelter. And not everybody, there's not enough room at the peak of the cold in the wintertime. The homeless shelter is full. So the ideological perspective of this source is that disparity and poverty is an issue in globalization, and because of it, some people's physiological needs are not being met and some aren't. And this individual is meant to represent the less developed southern hemisphere, including much of Africa. And this individual is meant to be the personification of the wealthy and maybe selfish northern hemisphere, including Canada, the United States, and most of Europe. So we had this quote that I had you guys look at before. Our world is one of terrible contradictions. Plenty of food, but 1 billion people go hungry. You can come on in, by the way. I'll just finish the sentence. Lavish lifestyles for a few, but poverty for too many others. Huge advances in medicine, while mothers die every day in childbirth. And children die every day from drinking dirty water. Billions spent on weapons to kill people instead of keeping them safe. So that's another example of the disparity, have and have not, the unequal distribution of our physiological needs, and therefore, according to Maslow, and according to that first tier, globalization has not been successful. So I'll pause the video there and give the floor to Mr. Damone.